Hi, this is Scott Bradfield again. This is our last brief lecture on or discussion of Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov, one of the great novels of novels ever. I don't know what period of time. It's just a great novel, and you should enjoy it. I'm kind of playing around with the way to present this talk rather than discuss critical thoughts or critical issues or explain what's happening in the book. I did a very inadequate description of the plot in the previous talk. And I think my main argument is to suggest that you look at these 5 sections as fairly equal when you read them. So the foreword obviously is not a foreword that we just sets up the context of the book. It's actually the beginning of the novel. We have to remember that when we read that opening, that the poem itself needs to be read carefully in sequence and without looking at the commentary. The commentary has to be looked at as something that comes after the poem, and the story arrives after the poem has been written, and it's presented to us after the poem's written, and that whole crazy fantasy, which is probably a fantasy of King Charles or Charles Kinbote or whoever you want to call him, is taking us up to the actual theft of the poem at the end of the commentary, and this is how it's being presented to us by Charles Kinbote, the crazed scholar and or renegade king from the land of Zembla. The 5th section is one that we can also accidentally miss, and that is the index to Pale Fire, which needs to be read like a piece of fiction, because it does a number of things, particularly our first time through the book. In almost just a look, as you look through the index, you see the complete fantasy of Pale Fire that has been fabricated by our critic. The entire 5 pages are as far from the real poem as you can get. They are entirely devoted to this crazy story of the land of Zembla and this king who's escaped and this greatest who's come out to kill him and the belovedness of that king and his own fantasies of himself. So just by looking at it, you can see that all of this stuff, all of which John Shade did not use in the poem, even though Kinbote is trying to argue that he's referring to it here and there, but he's rejected it, and he's deliberately rejected it. And at one point, at a party, Kinbote hears him talking about this crazy guy who's telling me stuff, and he's not sure it's him, but he's starting to suspect that maybe John Shade thinks he's crazy, and it's pretty sure that John Shade and his wife think he's crazy. So it kind of helps us recognize that now this entire fantasy is taken over in the index. It's kind of beautifully written, like every single thing that Nabokov wrote. And it starts to take us through from a baron, a puny traitor, to it reminds us of the group called the Shadows. Greatest is a member of a revolutionary group called the Shadows, who are supposed to sneak through the world and kill off all these aristocrats, and usually don't do a very good job like Greatest did. And it takes us through presentations of Greatest himself. So we have it's a summary of what he does in the course of the book, but it's a very selective summary that helps you remember the important parts of this character. You get to Charles X, it reminds us that he's the beloved, and it really reads through like a little story. So the sequentiality comes out perfectly well in this as well. We meet the king, we meet the enemy, we meet John Shade, and then when we get to Charles Kinbote, this is fun. This is kind of a fun part of the index. The longest entry in the index is for the author of the commentary. Not the author of the poem, not the subject of the poem, but the commentator. And here's you got 2 pages about his modesty. There's a section on his modesty. And there's his sense of humor. And there's kind of a glorification of the critic in that final part, which is very funny. We have, where's Hazel? The daughter, the subject of the book. We got to keep going. That's why you have to read this poem first. Hazel is the sad central character and a kind of powerful character. And of course, she's been reduced from 312 to deserves great respect. he never made contact with the central character of that poem, and he says she preferred the beauty of death to the ugliness of life. Now, there's just a cliche-ish romantic aphorism that Kinbote never got the story of Hazel and didn't care. It's a woman. I'm sure that had part to do with it. She's also his nemesis because Shade wants to tell her story and not his story. So he just dismisses her. So you really can see in context what's going on to this. But of course, that one line is quite a powerful line in what it leaves behind. And it does help you remember the power of that poem. The big key phrase for Nabokov is always, what does the reader need more than anything? A good reader needs a good memory. I've always thought that's my biggest weakness. I always had a terrible memory. So you remember, if you can remember that story of Hazel, that's a killer line. This guy didn't get any of it. Okay, so you need to kind of read these books quickly too. And then even John Shade is pretty much dismissed as basically as his important is always is his friendship with Kinbote. It's John Shade. It's a very funny passage. So don't skip the index, and it should really give you material you need when you go back to reread the book. Finally, my original plan had been to do a separate lecture on this really good book. Brian Boyd is the most enjoyable Nabokov scholar that I can think of. He wrote a great two-volume biography of Nabokov, which is really worth reading. And this is a great book for trying to understand Pale Fire and understand the complexities of Pale Fire. And I did read it at one point, and I was going to read it again, and I went through, I had read it before, and it had helped me, I guess. And what he does do that's very good is he really looks at the book. He doesn't look at lit crit stuff. He really looks at the book line by line. He quotes heavily from the novel and helps us understand large sections of it. I really like this book, and I think it probably helped me a bit, but I don't know that, and I think he certainly came up with certain presentations of Nabokov's ideas that really helps you understand the book. So it's worth reading, but I think you're ultimately better off just rereading Pale Fire, which is so good. There's one argument that he makes in this, which is worth closing on. Again, every single time, and this is a Boyd's argument as well, you read the text, the complications are getting more multifarious and more involving. So it becomes increasingly hard to get out of the book, which is the fun of it. And again, the first time through, you recognize the relationship between the critic and the writer. That's pretty obvious. Then you start to recognize the idea between the critic is actually the story of the king that he's telling. On your first way through, you sort of understand that much. Now, the second time through, you might start recognizing how much of it's a fabrication, how much of it is a fantasy. You might make those sorts of connections. If at any time you start doing what I'm warning you against, just popping back and forth to understand the poem, you can't understand the poem, obviously, through the commentary. If you start doing that, you're lost. But if you start to let these reflections kind of grow on you, they will continue growing. The final layer, according to Boyd, I think this is a fair summary. The final layer of Pale Fire is if you realize about your third or fourth time through, you might ultimately realize that the commentary, which has been written to help us not understand the poem, is the fabrication not of a neighbor next door, but of John Shade himself. That John Shade, the poet, has created his own commentary on his book. And that's a very interesting argument, one worth not thinking about too carefully the first few times through. But it does help you start to think about how this forgetting of the story of Hazel and the forgetting of this very powerful sense of loss of an author for his daughter can be expressed through this almost systematic denial of her story. that repression of her story has a certain power to it. So there's a lot of ways you can look at this book, and if you read any book about Pale Fire, this is very good just at the detailed line by line analysis of the poem. But I'd really recommend saving that for a few readings down the line. Give the book 2 or 3 shots by yourself, because it'll give you everything you need. It really does. Okay, have great. I'm going to probably do a little more Nabokov in the next few weeks. It's kind of fun going back to him, and there's quite a few little Nabokov books which I always like going back to. So maybe we'll think about another Nabokov in the near future. All right, bye-bye.